The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the member for, well, there used to be the member for Tauranga, Mr. Peters. We do need to remember that he came into Parliament in the 1970s, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. The Parliament should have experienced people. He's the same age as my father, and I'm very fond of my father, and I listen to him and I receive his wisdom, and that's quite right. But it's interesting to note that the Barter Bullets are making a comeback. At the moment, the Barter Bullets are making a comeback, but Peters is from the same era, but of course he never went away, and he's been here the whole time, so he can't make a comeback. But it's interesting that he is still promoting policies from that era, the 1970s. When monetary policy was run by the Minister of Finance, his good friend, Mr. Muldoon, and they would sit around in crimpoline suits. They'd work on their typewriters. They'd drink the gin and tonics at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'd figure out what to do. They'd figure out what to do with monetary policies, and it was all essentially about
Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, but it'd be very obvious here what was against parliamentary rulings and the Speaker's rulings on that manner. No, I shall tell you what it is. It was,
I've got
the awful allegation that any of us wore criminal suits.
Thank you. The member was casting a slur upon members with implications of imbibing, and I would ask the member to withdraw that comment and continue.
I withdraw that comment, Mr. Speaker. So, in essence, it was all about a little bit more inflation, and so when the economy was struggling, the Minister of Finance would turn the monetary taps on, and the result would be more inflation down the line. And the consequences of all that policy that Mr. Peters is now supposing that we should return to was that the savings of the hard-working people of this country were destroyed by inflation. The savings of a generation were destroyed. They'd put their money, they'd work hard all their lives, they'd put their money in the post office savings bank at 3%, locked away for 10 years, and find that that money was worth nothing compared with what it was because of inflation, because of these sorts of policies. And that this political control of monetary policy led to, fueled the industrial relations nightmares that we had in the 1970s. It fueled the speculation in asset prices around housing, and eventually it led to high interest rates, and we reaped the whirlwind of those policies in the 1980s, when people, when they were trying to buy houses, had to pay interest rates of 22%, up to 22% in Auckland. Just imagine how you could have survived. It was under the Labour Party that had to deal with the pent-up inflation that had been built up over generations, built up over the decades of high inflation policies that now Mr. Peters exposed. So the strategy of the 1970s that we're dealing with here again today was to steadily lower the value of the dollar. So what you did was, we started off at the start of the decade where the New Zealand dollar bought, one US dollar bought about $1.25 of New Zealand, so we had a stronger currency than the US dollar, and over the decade we got lower and lower and lower. And I've never quite understood the logic of what Mr. Peters is saying, that somehow the road for prosperity for New Zealand is to have a lower dollar, so we can get rich by making our currency weaker. That's a very strange policy. What you need is an economy that can sustain a strong currency. And it's true, overall people argue that the New Zealand dollar may be a little bit overvalued, and it swings through circumstances, but you don't go around getting prosperity by lowering your currency in the long term. So, and did exporters do so well back then when we supposedly had this high inflation policy and a lower dollar? Well, all the exporters relied on SMPs for the sheep and subsidies for their exporters. The Fletcher building, which I wrote a history of, there were about 15 years they never paid any income tax because of the export subsidies that they enjoyed. So how was that good? Now we've got a strong export economy. So if we look back over the past 5 years, so let's just take a broader issue. The idea that has been supposed by Mr. Peters is that something is drastically wrong with the New Zealand economy. Well, let's just look over what we've achieved in the past 5 years. Since 2008, when this government was brought in, this government was guided by two goals. One was to give New Zealanders a sense of security in difficult times, and secondly, to set the economy on a growth path. And when we look around, we would tackle the issues that were holding New Zealand back before the global financial crisis began. And so under this Prime Minister's strong and decisive leadership, we've seen good progress and we're headed in the right direction finally. The economy grew by 2.5% in the past year, and the forecasts are for growth around that level and perhaps a bit higher over the next couple of years. And that sounds modest by historical standards, but it would leave us amongst the world's strongest developed economies. Businesses are more confident than they have been for a while, and that's important for rebuilding investment intentions, Mr. Speaker. And last week we saw unemployment coming down further against a background of increasing participation in the workforce, which is pleasing. Unemployment is still higher than we would like. We believe families and households have shown considerable resilience over recent years, and the indications are that the confidence is picking up and are enjoying low interest rate, still the lowest in 50 years, relatively low costs of living, moderate wage increases, and this is starting to show through in growing consumption, Mr. Speaker. So in order, then the government is getting its own books in order. We're on track for surplus in 2014-15, and we'll have choices once we get to surplus about repaying debts and other priorities. And New Zealanders are getting better public services with improving results in difficult areas like education achievement and welfare dependency, where this government in the past 5 years has done more than anything that Mr. Peters has achieved in 30 years in Parliament, vulnerable children and law and order. So when we look at the ledger of what has been achieved in welfare reform in the past 5 years, it is magnificent. We're now in a position where over the next 2 or 3 years we have the opportunity to test how much more we can improve on those indicators of a healthy community. How many more young people we can get across the line for NCA Level 2, how many more vulnerable children we can reach into early childhood education, how many more vulnerable families we can keep out of welfare and get into work and a measure of self-sufficiency.
Point of order. Right on.
This is a first reading of a very important bill, and if you examine that speech, particularly this part now, he's never addressed one part of the speech of the bill at all.
Order. That's a debating point.
It's appalling.
It's not a point of order. Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't expect a person of his seniority to understand the complex argument that I'm building here. The complex argument that I'm building is that ultimately there is no foundation for this bill that's been put forward. The fundamental idea of this bill is that there is a major problem to be fixed, and what I'm trying to outline to the member, and I appreciate that I have to be a bit careful and slow in my articulation, is that this government is doing an exceptionally good job in the economy in difficult times. And so if you've got that situation, why would you then leap off into this wild area of speculation and return back to the 1970s policy? Because let's just see what this bill proposes. This bill proposes that the Reserve... It chokes me up just to think of it, Mr. Speaker. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act 1989 should be amended to ensure that the primary function of the Reserve Bank is broadened to include other critical macroeconomic factors such as the rate of growth, export growth, the value of the dollar and employment, as well as price stability. I can tell you what that means. What that means in code is let's just have a little bit more inflation, and somehow that's going to fix all our problems. Somehow, if we just allow a little bit more inflation, everything will be solved. And as we've seen in the 1970s, that doesn't work. And can I just outline some of the risks that were highlighted to the New Zealand economy today by the Reserve Bank in the Financial Stability Report? While this government has made good progress in difficult times, it would not be a good idea at this moment when, as the Reserve Bank has articulated today, we have an imbalance in the housing market, which is a risk to the financial stability. We have high levels of external debt, particularly in the dairy sector. There is external indebtedness, and there are risks of downside in the global economy, and we only have to look at whether or not the Chinese economy will continue to be as robust and strong as it has. There's further financial stress in Europe. There's a sharp increase in long-term interest rates and a transition to a higher, tighter global monetary policy. And there is also the risk of political intransience in the US surrounding the public debt ceiling negotiation. So would this be, in any logical outlining, would this be a good time to change course on what we're doing at the moment and leap off into some retro barter bullet style policies of the 1970s as is being proposed by Winston Peters. I don't think so. And I think that is why drawing into a conclusion of where we got to in this speech is that the National Party does not support this legislation and does not support what Mr Peters is trying to do, and we do encourage him in the strongest possible terms to read his history and to look back over the experience of New Zealand in the past and realise it's one thing to live it, it's another thing to understand it, and to realise what went on in New Zealand and to rethink this bill and in fact withdraw it because we won't be supporting it. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members, we move to 5-minute calls. The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, I suppose the most notable thing of that speech was he says the currency's